I've seen a lot of people go for the ultra-cheap mini PCs that promise office-grade performance for the price of a cheap router, only to end up with machines that stutter when they open a spreadsheet or crash the moment they add a second monitor. That regret is real, and it's why I wanted to see if the Lenovo ThinkCentre Tiny M90q Gen 5 actually feels like a smarter purchase instead of another disappointment. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's walk through what it's really like to live with this box for a full workday, and whether the price tag matches the experience. First off, the ThinkCentre Tiny is built for the kind of office that wants a PC that disappears behind a monitor but still packs enough horsepower for everyday tasks. The i7-14700 vPro with 20 cores, 8 performance and 12 efficiency, sounds impressive on paper, but the real test is whether it can keep up with typical office software, a couple of browser tabs, and maybe a light video call. In my tests, opening Outlook, Teams, and a Chrome window with 10 tabs was buttery smooth. Even when I launched a local Power BI report that pulls a few megabytes of data, the system never hit a noticeable lag. That kind of responsiveness is exactly what you need when you're juggling multiple client files and can't afford to wait for a processor to catch up. The 16 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM is another area where the ThinkCentre earns its keep. Many competing mini PCs still ship with 8 gigabytes or slower DDR4, which can become a bottleneck as soon as you add a PDF editor or a browser with many extensions. With 16 gigabytes, the ThinkCentre handled a full day of remote meetings, a couple of Excel pivot tables, and a background file sync without swapping to the SSD. Speaking of storage, the 512 gigabytes PCIe NVMe SSD feels spacious enough for a typical knowledge worker setup, and the read/write speeds are on par with any modern laptop. I was able to copy a 5 gigabytes project folder in under 10 seconds, which is a nice sanity check if you work with large media files occasionally. Now, the form factor is where the tiny part of the name truly shines. The chassis measures just a few inches on each side, so it slides under a 27-inch monitor or tucks neatly into a small office shelf. The external ports are well thought out: 2 USB-C, 1 with power delivery, 3 USB-A, HDMI 2.0, and a dedicated RJ45 Ethernet port. I've never needed a dongle to plug in my wired network, and the HDMI output drives a 4K display at 60 Hz without any flicker, which is handy if you want a crisp secondary screen for design work or data dashboards. Wi-Fi 6 also shows up in the specs, but in practice the wired connection feels more reliable for video calls, which is something any remote worker will appreciate. One of the hidden trade-offs with a device this compact is the power supply. The 230W unit is sufficient for the i7 and integrated UHD 770 graphics, but it leaves no headroom for a dedicated GPU or additional high-power USB devices. If you plan to add a heavy external hard drive rack or a USB-C dock with multiple SSDs, you might notice the power draw creeping up, and the system could throttle under sustained load. For most office scenarios, document editing, web browsing, light photo work, that isn't an issue, but it's something to keep in mind if you think you'll turn this box into a mini render farm. Another practical consideration is upgradability. Lenovo markets the ThinkCentre as future-proof, and the interior does let you swap out the RAM and the SSD fairly easily if you're comfortable opening a tiny chassis. The RAM slots are reachable and the SSD sits on a standard M.2 slot, so you could move from 16 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes or bump the storage to a 1 terabyte NVMe drive down the line. However, the screws are tiny, and the limited space means you'll need a magnetic screwdriver and a steady hand. If you're not inclined to tinker, you'll be stuck with the original configuration for the life of the machine. So, who should actually buy the ThinkCentre Tiny M90q Gen 5? If you're a remote employee, a small business owner, or a freelancer who needs a reliable, low-profile workstation that can handle productivity suites, video conferencing, and occasional light media work, this is a solid match. The vPro capabilities also add a layer of remote management that IT departments love. Think secure firmware updates, and the ability to push policies without stepping onto the desk. On the other hand, if you're a gamer, a video editor who relies on GPU acceleration, or someone who wants to run multiple virtual machines with heavy workloads, you'll quickly feel the limits of the integrated graphics and the modest power budget. The pricing lands somewhere in the mid-range for business-grade mini PCs. Considering the i7-14700 vPro, DDR5 memory, and a fast NVMe drive, the cost feels justified compared to a similarly spec'd small form factor from a competitor that often charges a premium for brand name alone. The real value comes from the combination of performance, network,